Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue's BOOMTOWN Summit. Congratulations on your prompt arrival this morning, and if it's a case of begin as you mean to go on, that's outstanding. My name's Rowan Barker and I'm pleased to be your MC for today's event. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who are present. A reminder as well before we kick off, if you could turn your mobiles off. First one that goes off, Christopher says, has to pay for WestConnect Stage 3, so there's a pretty good incentive. I'd also like to acknowledge our dignitaries, which in a room of VIPs is pretty difficult to do, but firstly Victorian Treasurer, the Honourable Tim Pallas, and we'll hear from the Treasurer in a moment. Parliamentarians, Secretaries of State and Commonwealth agencies and departments, Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue patrons, including former New South Wales Premier the Honourable Nick Greiner AC, City Mayors and Councillors, Dialogue partners, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. We will also soon, but perhaps not as soon as we might like, be joined by the New South Wales Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, the Honourable Andrew Constance, who does have responsibility for intrastate air services, which is what has failed him this morning. So instead of flying here, he is driving. But we'll keep you up to date with his progress. But he is to make up for it chatting drinks this afternoon when we're done, so stick around for that. Also, New South Wales Deputy Labor Leader Michael Daly. BOOMTOWN 2016 is the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue's inaugural major projects conference, this year focusing on value capture as a mechanism to help fund Australia's infrastructure deficit and urban renewal in our great cities of the West. The complex public policy issues around value sharing and exactly how and where it can be applied are not broadly understood by the community or even by business. And there's a risk that without a strong political debate, stakeholder engagement and sectoral leadership, we may lose the opportunity to best bring forward ideas, address myths and prejudice and build community and industry support. And we hope BOOMTOWN 2016 will be a catalyst for this debate. We're pleased to partner with Transport for New South Wales, which is at the epicentre of billions of dollars of current and planned investment. But any projects that don't directly relate to road or rail, such as hospitals, schools, stadia, airports and social housing, are inextricably linked to transport anyway. So partnering with Transport for New South Wales is an outstanding fit for this event, and we thank Tim Reardon and his team for their contribution. We also acknowledge the boss of many of these projects, the Minister Andrew Constance, who now at about midday will tell us why he believes value sharing should be integral to delivering projects around the state and therefore vital to the economic and social wellbeing of New South Wales. Alongside Transport for New South Wales, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Westline Partnership as BOOMTOWN event partners, the team that secured government support for the Olympic Corridor Light Rail. I'd also like to thank our event sponsors Deloitte, First State Super, Lend-Lease and Sydney Airport, and there are a host of other supporters who have come together to contribute to the success of today's event. You can see those listed on the screen behind me. Thank you to those organisations for supporting the event, and thank you for your attendance here today. With the release last week of the Greater Sydney Commission's draft district plans, a Prime Minister wanting 30-minute cities via his city deals, a Premier with a huge appetite for investment and unprecedented population growth, BOOMTOWN 2016 is a timely opportunity to lead the national discussion on how we can fund the cities of tomorrow through real examples and showcase some of the work already being done, particularly in the midst of the Western Sydney infrastructure boom. Unashamedly, much of our focus today will therefore be on the BOOMTOWN, that is Sydney, and specifically Western Sydney, the so-called infrastructure capital of the world. But Victoria, it must be said, has also been very active in this space and in some ways has been seen as the nation's leader when it comes to elegant design, sustainability and technology. To talk about the elements which have contributed to Melbourne's status as the world's most livable city a number of times, and they're always happy to tell you, and to open BOOMTOWN 2016 with a national flavour, I would like to invite to the lectern the man who holds the purse strings for our southern neighbour, Victorian Treasurer, the Honourable Tim Pallas. Tim Pallas was elected to the Victorian Parliament in 2006 and is the state member for Werribee. Following the election in 2014, he was sworn in as Victoria's 50th Treasurer. His first budget in May 2015 contained the biggest education budget and investment in public transport in Victoria's history. His second budget this year was the single biggest school capital investment in the state's history, also fully funding the construction of Melbourne's new metro tunnel. Tim Pallas has previously served as Minister for Roads and Ports and later Major Projects. As Treasurer, we've seen a significant improvement in Victoria economically, with the fastest growth in full-time jobs in the nation. So to give us a national perspective on infrastructure, please welcome the Treasurer of Victoria, the Honourable Tim Pallas.
Thanks very much, Rowan, and it gives me great pleasure to be here. I consider this conference a little bit geographically challenged. BOOMTOWN, the infrastructure capital of the world. The one thing I can tell you about Sydney is you never hide your light under a bushel. But I'm here to put an alternative proposition that perhaps Melbourne is doing better at the moment, but also to make this point that our nation does best when we do have a bit of healthy rivalry between our two major cities. And why is that? Well, because we push ourselves to do that much more, that much better in terms of the offering that we have, both in terms of infrastructure, but of course most notably in the context of the conference that you have today, we do particularly well when it comes to policy around infrastructure. So I always enjoy visiting Sydney. It's a rousing city, to say the least, but it always makes me appreciate, of course, the world's most livable city, just that tiny bit more. And look, can I pass on my commiserations to Sydney about falling outside the top 10 for the world's most livable cities? I'm told we're here today to discuss New South Wales' credentials as a national leader in infrastructure investment. I know you'd be disappointed if I didn't stake Victoria's claim to that title. I'm a curious first speaker for this conference, that being the case, particularly given that your sponsors might not be entirely thrilled with my contribution. It seems to me that New South Wales and Sydney in particular has developed a bit of a mythology around its economic performance lately. When I came up here, it sometimes seems like there's a belief that the only place experiencing a resurgence in growth and investment is Sydney, and that the rest of Australia is asleep. And it's simply just not true. The most recent ABS labour force statistics indicate that Victoria created more jobs in the last year than the rest of Australia combined. Our first budget in 2015 created $22 billion in new capital projects to expand the rail network, to cut congestion on roads, to build schools and to upgrade hospitals. Our second budget, announced in April this year, included $12.4 billion for capital infrastructure projects, and it lifted our average annual net capital investment to $7.4 billion per annum over the forward estimates period. So during the next decade, that investment will include $6.8 billion in road infrastructure, including $5.5 billion for the Western Distributor Road Tunnel, $2.9 billion for rail infrastructure, nearly $1 billion for health infrastructure, including new buildings, health equipment and projects to increase the capacity of hospitals, and nearly $900 million for new and upgraded school facilities right across the state under a schools capital program. Now, the investment is in addition to the $10.9 billion Melbourne Metro Tunnel project and the $5 to $6 billion that we're putting in place to remove level crossings. And might I say, if we're talking about where Sydney has a policy head start on Victoria, level crossings are an anachronism that this city knows nothing of. I think General Holmes Drive is one of about 3 or 4 left in all of metropolitan Sydney. Well, share a thought for Melbourne, and I'm sure you'll share a generous thought of pity that we have about 180 of them, and they come at a cost of anything upwards of 120 million each to remove. So this government's aggressive infrastructure agenda would not be possible without the strength of the Victorian economy. In fact, our state final demand has increased for 7 consecutive quarters. Like New South Wales, of course, a more realistic value attributable to the Australian dollar is helping. Another reason is our accelerating construction activity. The value of Victorian building approvals recorded the highest ever monthly figures for the state in September. According to the ABS, the monthly record of $3.5 billion was driven by non-residential approvals increasing by 52.9%, underlying the strength of the Victorian economy and also the confidence in it. The strong result is a boost for jobs and was supported by a number of big approvals across diverse sectors, including commercial, health, aged care and accommodation. Earlier this month, the ABS also confirmed Victoria's jobs growth is the best in the nation. Over the past year, of course, we've created more jobs than the rest of the country combined. Since the election of the Andrews Labor government, 184,000 jobs have been created, and today is our second anniversary as a government. More than 93,000 of those jobs have been full-time. Just an incredible turnaround in circumstances when you think about it. The move to part-time and insecure employment has been pretty standard right across Australia for the last 2 decades, and now we see a move to full-time employment. Victoria's unemployment rate is down to 5.7%, still above New South Wales, but of course our participation rate in the economy is very high, the highest amongst the states. So this was against the growth in our participation rate is against the national trend. Every other state experienced a decline in labour force participation, some as much as 2.5 percentage points. Victoria is the only state in the nation with above-trend growth and accelerating economic momentum, according to both CommSec and the ANZ State of the States. Despite global challenges, Victoria is defying the broader trend and becoming the engine room of the Australian economy. Standard & Poor's recently reaffirmed our AAA credit rating. Not sure that they're going to reaffirm the Commonwealth's the way things are heading. And I've got to say, anything that can be done in respect of that certainly requires attention from the Commonwealth. But what the Standard & Poor's had to say about Victoria was that it was reaffirming our AAA and said that Victoria's strong financial management and economy warranted that confirmation. Our business confidence is in positive territory and has been for 13 months. And only 2 weeks ago, the ABS confirmed Victoria's economic performance in 15-16 was the strongest in 8 years. The Victorian economy grew by 3.3% in 15-16. That's the highest since 2007-8 and exceeded our own budget forecasts. And might I say, perhaps politically motivated, it is 4 times faster than the growth rate that we inherited from the previous government. In addition to surging dwelling investment, growth was underpinned by underlying business investment and household consumption, which grew by a solid 3.2%. Services exports reached a record $16.5 billion, driven by international education and overseas tourism. Our economic activity of 3.3% far outstripped the national average of 2.8% and was significantly faster than the previous year's economic growth of 2.6%. So not surprisingly, construction made a huge contribution to Victoria's GSP in 15-16. And of course, there's very practical reasons why economic activity is buoyant in Victoria. It's all about population growth. At 1.9% at the moment and 1.8% for 14-15, Victoria's population growth is the strongest in the nation by a country mile. In fact, the next closest is New South Wales on 1.4%. So more than 2,200 people are choosing to call Victoria home each week. I take pleasure in pointing out that people from New South Wales are choosing to move to Victoria. In 2015 calendar year, we were the beneficiaries of net migration from New South Wales of over 4,200 people. So population is a fantastic driver of economic growth, provided you keep up with it. Every time I boast about Victoria's population growth, I keep 2 things in the back of my mind. Firstly, people will only continue to come to Victoria if we continue to offer a superior quality of life. Secondly, the population growth only leads to economic growth as long as your economy continues to create opportunities. And that means governments have to invest, and they have to do it in a smart and timely way. And that, I think, is probably the message that impacts upon not only the state of Victoria but the state of New South Wales as well. Making sure that our investments are timely, appropriate, that they're rationally constructed, and that they're backed up by policy offerings that engage the private sector will be key to our success. Can we keep the infrastructure pipeline in place to keep business focused, to deal with the community's expectations as population growth impacts upon their lifestyle. It's the reason why much of the state's population growth in Melbourne is in our urbanised area, concentrated in the outer north, west and the southeast of the city. It's for that reason that rail services servicing these new growth areas in the Sunbury line, the Cranbourne-Pakenham line, will give them their own dedicated CBD access through the Melbourne Metro project. That project will provide the greatest jobs growth in the area and will provide people with access to the CBD in the medical and the university precincts in Parkville and St Kilda Road. Easy access to these precincts by public transport will cut congestion and also boost productivity, and these investments don't come cheaply. The options for state governments, of course, to construct are limited. We could generate operating surpluses, and of course we're doing that. We're running average surpluses in the state of Victoria of $2.1 billion each and every year over the next 4 years, and in this current, or in the last financial year, I produced a budget surplus of $2.9 billion. So the first two options around creating surpluses, recycling assets, and finally, of course, mobilising Commonwealth grants. The first two options, operating surpluses and asset recycling, feature strongly in Victoria's infrastructure funding mix. The recycling, of course, of the recent lease of the Port of Melbourne received a record $9.7 billion transaction, which was a huge vote of confidence in the Victorian economy. When you think of it, we leased the Port of Melbourne that's a single port, for a 50-year lease for $9.7 billion. Port of Botany and the Port of Kembla leased for 100 years for half that, thereabouts. Clearly we managed, or we picked our time to intervene into the market to perfection. The proceeds of the lease will, as promised, go into the Victorian Transport Fund and then be used to support vital infrastructure projects right across Victoria. That's a great piece of asset recycling. The third option, and would be remiss of me not to demonstrate some unhappiness with the federal government in terms of our share of federal funding. I suppose the appropriate title of this conference, a BOOMTOWN, Sydney, is certainly doing very nicely out of federal government allocations at the moment, certainly by comparison to Victoria. Victoria's share of national infrastructure funding dropped as low as 9% last year, a figure in stark contrast to the state's 25% share of national population and our similar share contribution to GDP output. In other words, Victorians are being shortchanged. Not that I begrudge Sydney the largesse that is being showered down upon you from a Sydney-centric federal government. Given this shortfall, the state will need new strategies to fund the investment required over the next decade. One of these strategies is tapping into our additional borrowing capacity. And this is where you see a divergence in terms of the approach between the New South Wales government and the Victorian government. Whilst the New South Wales government is talking about moving towards zero debt, I've been talking about increasing the state of Victoria's debt levels. When we came to government, our debt levels were around about 6.2% as a share of our gross state product. It's my intention to move those levels, which are now down to about 4.6%, back up to 6% and leave them there for a decade, or so long as I have the capacity for the policy setting to be maintained. That, together with a long-run capacity of unallocated capital out of the budget, gives the state, without assistance from the Commonwealth, of somewhere around $90 to $95 billion over the next decade. So the challenge for us is exactly how best to plan and use those funds, and quite frankly, I've given up wasting my time engaging the federal government around these issues. Infrastructure, of course, is one of the best investments a government can make. It deepens markets through improved freight and transport routes, and it brings consumers closer to businesses. It also offers workers more job opportunities. It's one of the keys to meeting the challenges of population growth, and it's critical to ensuring that Victoria adapts successfully to a modern economy. So I want to talk now just briefly about the structures that we've put in place. Since we've been in government, we've decided that the most important thing to do is to ensure that we establish a structure of independent advice so that we can build the right infrastructure at the right time. So we've maintained that by establishing Infrastructure Victoria, a new independent body that will give Victorians immediate and long-term infrastructure needs, that they're identified and that they're prioritised based on objective, transparent analysis and evidence. The expert body will also independently assess the economic, environmental and social merits of major projects and also publish research on a number and a range of infrastructure issues. IV will give our communities and the private sector greater certainty about the state's infrastructure needs and the Labor government's strong long-term plans to meet them. For the past 2 years, we've delivered on the things that matter most to people: growing a stronger economy, creating more jobs and providing more opportunities for Victorians to build a future. And today, the facts speak for themselves. Our economy is growing faster than it has in almost a decade. The latest jobs and economic growth figures are outstanding. A AAA credit rating and accelerating momentum are the envy of other states. And we're investing in the infrastructure and planning activities our state needs to grow and prosper. But we can do so much more together. And the fundamental proposition that I would leave with you today is the fact that Victoria and New South Wales are back in contest again is a good thing for New South Wales and for Victoria. Yes, it will bring with it attendant problems about how we manage the demands upon the construction industry, and if we don't work in cooperation in managing those pipelines, then there will be a considerable cost to us all. But nonetheless, these are the challenges of opportunity and growth, something that our two great states are very pleased to be enjoying at the moment. And whilst I might take exception to the idea of Sydney being a boom town, it's great that the contest is booming. Thank you very much.
He doesn't get off that easy. Clear, though, that your theory that investment begets investment, your infrastructure investment begets private sector investment, also fosters the competition that drives the economic growth that's seeing you lead the nation at the moment. Thank you for that perspective and some insights into how things are done south of the Murray. Please take a seat. I'm going to introduce a couple of people who are going to join you now for an interview on national infrastructure projects. Our first guest, Philip Davies, is Chief Executive of Infrastructure Australia. Philip is a chartered engineer and experienced infrastructure executive with 25 plus years shaping policy, delivering nationally significant infrastructure projects and leading reform within the infrastructure sector in Australia and the UK. As Chief Executive of Infrastructure Australia, he will drive the 15-year infrastructure plan and strategic framework for Australia's infrastructure and its future needs across transport, water, energy and telecommunications. And to interview Tim Pallas and Philip Davies, we're pleased to have with us today Jenny Wiggins, who's the Senior Companies Reporter from the Australian Financial Review. Well, that's her official title anyway. She really is the infrastructure guru at the AFR. Jenny's a highly experienced journalist who's been with the Fin since 2010, covering infrastructure and transport. Jenny has over 20 years' experience as a financial journalist, including a decade with the UK's Financial Times, covering consumer industries out of London and capital markets from New York. Please make them welcome.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Tim. I thought you raised a lot of very timely points in your opening remarks. And one that I wanted to pick up on was this idea of tapping into additional borrowing capacity. Those of you who've actually read the AFR this morning may have seen a story that we're running today which discusses the OECD's view that Australia should actually be spending more money on infrastructure, as well as other governments around the world, and the OECD's estimating that Australia can actually afford to spend $16 billion over the next 2 years. before it actually hurts its ability to borrow in the international debt markets. Now, obviously, governments, federal and state, are very concerned about AAA credit ratings, and I got the impression from your speech that you thought government could pursue this spending without actually affecting its AAA credit rating. Is that correct? And can you also explain a bit about why governments care so much about AAA ratings? Couldn't they afford to drop down to AA?
Certainly on the first issue, is there a capacity for additional borrowing? If you look at the unborrowed capital allocation out of the state of Victoria at the moment, it's coming in year on year at $7.4 billion a year, so let's call it $15 billion over the next 2 years, so it's pretty close to the sort of number that the OECD identified. Obviously they were talking extra effort, not existing effort, but I make the point that the 10-year long run average infrastructure investment in the state of Victoria out of consolidated revenue, that is the state's funds, comes in at about $4.9 billion a year. So we've already, in our first 2 years of government, increased that allocation by about 50%. So it's a quantum leap in terms of increase. We've also similarly seen our debt drop. And I've been pretty clear about this. Some of that is a one-off impact as a consequence of course, the lease of the port, which could see our debt levels drop as low as 4% of GSP if we allowed them to continue in that direction. It's not my intention to see that happen. I want to see our debt levels get back to about 6%. We know it doesn't compromise our AAA for anything we've done because, well, it was higher than that under the Conservatives only 2 years earlier. But a consistent debt profile together with a credible infrastructure agenda, I think, is the key here. And importantly, I think the great opportunity for the states is to start to talk about how we can cooperate a lot closer with the private sector. We've been quite innovative in public-private partnerships. In Victoria at the moment, we have 31 of them that have already been put away, and we're already talking about public-private partnerships that are going to be quite considerable for arterial road building in the west of metropolitan Melbourne as part of the construction of the Melbourne Metro project, and of course the Western Distributor, all public-private partnerships. So as a government, we want to maximise the value of our engagement with the private sector. We want to use their skills, their expertise, and dare I say it, their money, to make sure that we can deliver the infrastructure that Victoria needs. And under our population demands at the moment, you'd appreciate that those needs are pretty urgent.
And just on the AAA credit rating, would you be prepared to drop down to AA if you could spend more money on infrastructure? Because presumably that improves economic growth, eases congestion, keeps making Melbourne a livable city.
Well, it might be a theoretical discussion more than anything else. Certainly my very strong preference is to keep the AAA for a couple of reasons. Yes, it's a marginal difference in terms of our borrowing rate. Probably comes to no more than about $30 million a year in extra borrowing costs for the state of Victoria if you drop from AAA to AA+. But it's a discipline that I'm keen to keep. So as I say, it may be a moot discussion in the sense that there is a line of thinking that says if the Commonwealth loses their AAA, then no sub-sovereign jurisdiction can pierce the sovereign barrier and have a higher credit rating. There are only one or two examples of that occurring around the world. So it may be something that is not entirely within my control, but to the extent it is within my control, I hope that we continue to have a AAA disciplined economy, largely because it provides us with opportunities. The one thing I have been keen to say, however, is what's the point of having a AAA rated economy? It's a credit rating after all, and if you don't use it, you lose it. And as a state, certainly from my perspective, having access to AAA credit ratings, the lower credit rating, the lower access to interest that a AAA credit rating gives you, then of course it opens up more opportunity. So my hope, my ambition and my intention is to try and preserve the AAA credit rating for the state of Victoria, and you'll see that in the policy settings that we put in place. If perchance we were to lose that due to no circumstances of our own, then we would continue the disciplines that put the AAA and preserve the AAA in place.
Right. You also mentioned that you thought Victoria was being shortchanged by the federal government. Bit of tension there between state and federal policy. How can the federal government and states work better together?
Well, look, I think part of the answer is probably provided by the body that Phil overlooks in Infrastructure Australia. I think we've got to get to a point where we agree what are the infrastructure needs for the nation, and every state should be expected to offer up projects that can be the subject of rigorous analysis. We're happy to do that. We're the first and I think the only state to have actually produced publicly our business case on major projects, and we've done that because we think we do need to have a substantial debate around, firstly, what the priority for infrastructure is, how you deliver it, and over what time frame, so that you build the right infrastructure at the right time. So from our perspective, having independent bodies to advise both the state of Victoria and the nation, working in cooperation, identifying those projects, firstly gets us to a point where we can have at least a common understanding of those projects, and from there it's really just being able to effectively advocate our case. And from my perspective, I think it's transparently obvious that the state of Victoria has been very poorly dealt with by the Commonwealth. We tend to whinge about our share. I mean, we're 3% of the land mass of the nation, but we're also the fastest growing metropolitan area in the nation by quite some distance. And, the tyranny of distance has been overridden by the tyranny of proximity, and that's urban congestion. Both our major cities, Sydney and Melbourne, Brisbane to a lesser extent, are dealing with the issues of urban congestion, and it's much more expensive than building infrastructure into our rural and regional areas. So what I say is the size of the state doesn't matter. The size of its contribution to the national wellbeing does, and whatever you put a dead weight around our capacity to achieve our true potential, then you're doing the nation a disservice.
Philip, the government released its response to your 15-year Australian infrastructure plan last week, and it's said it's in favour of most of the recommendations. Now that we've come this far, we've got the government's response, we have the plan. How do we actually go about implementing them?
Yeah, thanks. Just picking up on the Treasurer's points, I think a very strong theme of the 15-year plan was long-term integrated planning and getting that right, getting our investment priorities clear for good projects. That's been a strong focus for us. That's a strong focus for the plan. The government response was very supportive of the recommendations that we made, but there's still an awful lot of work to do around delivering those recommendations, particularly around getting better land use planning and integrating our planning. To the fund, I'm glad you didn't ask me the AAA question, because as everyone knows, our role is to support the planning process and identify priorities, not get involved in the funding. Thank goodness we've got some great treasurers who can do that for us. So in terms of the planning, though, there's still a lot of work to do to get the integrated land use planning right, but also to get more out of our existing infrastructure. So we've probably got most of the infrastructure we need. It's getting pretty expensive and hard to build new infrastructure into our cities, but we certainly need a greater focus on getting more out of the existing infrastructure. So strong focus on planning, good response last week from the government, particularly around two of the key recommendations, one around taking a more national approach to looking at our freight and supply chains, and another around the need to look at transport reform for the longer term in terms of how do we fund and how do we pay for the operations and maintenance of our transport infrastructure. So good steps forward with that, but the hard work really begins now.
Just picking up on that point about getting more value out of existing infrastructure, one of the complaints I often hear from people is that politicians are too keen to cut ribbons and build big, shiny new infrastructure projects because it gets them votes. I mean, do you think that's a real issue, and is that something that Infrastructure Australia can actually make a difference in, sort of go back to governments and say, well, actually we don't think this project is necessarily going to achieve all the objectives that you want it to achieve, and if you spend a bit of money here, improving this rail network or upgrading this road, actually you'll get the same result for much less money?
Yeah, again, certainly that was one of the things that we found from the audit we released in May 2015, and we followed that up as part of the 15-year plan, really with a narrative around the need to make greater use of the data that we have, greater use of data, greater analytics to actually look, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How can we be smarter using existing infrastructure? How can we spread the load on the existing infrastructure? And then actually, how can we use technology in a good way? So I think there's been some good steps forward with that, particularly around rail improvements with rail signalling around the country in the last few years, getting more throughput through our heavy rail network. But also in terms of the road network, how can we get more use out of existing infrastructure? Smart motorways was something that came to the fore a few years ago, and again is back on the agenda in terms of, instead of building extra lanes, actually use technology to get more through existing lanes. So we're seeing more of that. It's certainly something we're encouraging, and not surprisingly, those investments give a much greater return on investment than building expensive new infrastructure, particularly in our capital cities where, we often have to build tunnels to get the infrastructure in.
We're also going to hear a lot about value capture today, and I guess we were talking earlier about one of the most well-known examples of how value capture has been used well is on the new Crossrail underground development in London, where businesses that will benefit from the new lines are paying additional taxes. As far as I'm aware, it still hasn't been used to any great extent. There's a couple of projects that are trying to use value capture. Why has Australia been quite slow to take up value capture, and how do we get businesses on board to support paying for infrastructure projects that will be in everyone's interest in the long term?
Well, I'm sure Tim will want to speak on this as well. So one of the projects funded in the past through value capture was the Melbourne Rail Loop. It's probably one of the most high-profile projects, and we have used value capture in the past. We still continue to use value capture. I think why it's come to the fore now is that funding projects is increasingly difficult. They're more expensive because of the built urban environment. So we need other ways of paying for our projects. I stopped talking about the Crossrail project in London for a while because it was being overused to demonstrate value capture, but now I'm talking about it again but through a slightly different lens, because I think there's a set of circumstances that we need to create, and again it comes back to getting the long-term planning right. And where Crossrail is interesting is that project was planned to death over a period of 40 years, and the consequence of that, which I think is a lesson for us, that the community and the business community understood what that investment would bring to them very clearly, and actually it created an environment then where all levels of government came together, got their checkbooks out, and they still couldn't afford to fund the project. And at that point, the conversation moved on to was driven by the business community, interestingly, to say, actually, we'd like to make a contribution to this. We can see the benefits this project will bring to our businesses. And actually, if you don't deliver the project, we're going to take our businesses to Europe or somewhere else. So it was an interesting set of circumstances where everyone got around the table and made a contribution, which actually, and the business community tipped it over the edge. The project still wouldn't be being built now if the business community hadn't made that contribution. And so I think, it's about getting the long-term planning right, getting everyone sat around the table, having having a conversation around, what are the good projects, what are the priorities, and then how are we going to pay for them.
Jenny, just to add to that, in a lot of ways there's nothing new in infrastructure funding, but if you go back to the 1970s, I think it was the Bolte and subsequently the Hamer government that actually put an area charge in the development of the City Loop on businesses, and it's very similar in terms of a mechanism to what's applying on the Crossrail at the moment. But I think states have a lot of levers at their advantage. For the state of Victoria and in Melbourne in particular, we have a lot of government-owned land in very close proximity to the Melbourne Metro rail project. We're the planning body, so that we can basically make sure that as we bring that land into the marketplace, as a development is occurring, well, the state can capture the value, and clearly it's our intention to do that. But we're going to do it in a way that we think is sympathetic to the needs of the communities that we're going to build up and around the Melbourne Metro. But it does really raise the question, well, how does the federal government and the states work in cooperation in this area?